Okay, so now we're going to finish talking about neuronal conduction, and we are going to talk about how we get the nerve or neuron, reset and ready to be fired again. So let's recap what we've talked about. We started off talking about the dendrites and excitatory postsynaptic potentials, and this is where you've got the neurotransmitter binding on either directly or indirectly, causing channels to open and positive charge to come in. The positive charge builds up and moves toward the axon hillock by cable properties, which is just really the diffusion of the positive charges over there. When it reaches here, it has to create enough positive charge here to reach threshold. And what threshold actually is a movement of minus 75 millivolts to approximately minus 55 millivolts on the inside of the cell membrane at the axon hillock. When that happens, we have depolarization. Sodium channels open and sodium ions carrying positive charge come in. Now let's remind ourselves, again, it's always worth just continuously repeating the same thing over and over so that we're all on the same page. Keep in mind that it's positive on the outside of this neuron because of the high concentration of sodium ions. In all cells of the human body, sodium ions are in high concentration outside, 10 times at least more than inside the cell. Sodium is the highest concentration gradient in the body, and it is therefore the driver of most physiology in the body because of this. Because when you open a sodium channel that flows in, it creates a very quick change inside the cell of depolarization. So that big sodium gradient outside to in, once you reach threshold, is released in this area. These two voltage gated channels open, sodium rushes in, creating this big positive charge. Minus 55, it actually carries on all the way through to plus 30 millivolts. But when it hits there, threshold has been reached and these gates open, positive charge comes in, it continues on to 30 millivolts, and that causes enough positive charge to open the next set of gates. The same thing happens all the way down to the axon terminal. That was depolarization, an influx of sodium ion due to a threshold event at the axon hillock. But now, if that's all we do, then we can only fire the neuron once. And of course we all understand that the neurons have to fire many, many times just in doing simple tasks. So there's still more to the story. And the rest of the story is actually about repolarization, or getting the membrane back to positive outside, negative inside, and rebuilding your sodium gradient high on the outside, low on the inside, and your potassium gradient high on the inside, low on the outside, like always at resting membrane potential. Every night you go to bed, think to yourself, inside a cell, membrane is negatively charged. Inside the cell, potassium is in high concentration compared to outside. Outside the cell, it's positively charged, mainly by the presence of sodium ions and other positive ions such as calcium. And sodium is in very high concentration outside. Once you get that stuck in your head, resting membrane potential is about minus 75 millivolts due to these reasons. You'll be able to understand a lot more of this very easily. Okay, so we've talked about depolarization. Now we're going to talk about how we get it set up to go again. So the second thing that we need to think about in repolarization is, how do you get that positive charge back out? Well, we have potassium voltage gated channels very close by the sodiums. Now the really key important thing about the potassium voltage gated channels is they don't open at minus 55 millivolts. They don't open until it becomes less negative. anywhere between -50 and 0, for example. So the sodium gates open first and positive charge rushes in. But by the time it's hit plus 30 millivolts, potassium channels have now opened and potassium has left. Now why is that important? Well, potassium has a positive charge. So if you open up a door and let all this positive charge on the sodium come in, but then open up another door and let the potassium leave, because it's got a higher concentration inside than out, so when you allow it to do something it will leave by its own diffusion, then what was positive can go back to becoming negative. So the first stage of repolarization is resetting the electrical gradient. Now remember, the gradient in electricity is positive outside, negative inside. That's what a cell is at resting membrane potential. So to get the electrical gradient correct, you want it back like that. When threshold is reached and sodium comes in, it briefly becomes positive positive. But by the opening of the potassium channels directly after the sodium channels, takes positive charge back out and you've got positive negative. You've reset the electrical gradient. Now you haven't finished everything in repolarization at this stage, but importantly, if you really needed to fire this neuron again, as long as you have the electrical gradient reset up, you could make it fire again. And this is called relative refractory. During this period, the neuron hasn't completely reset itself up, but it can be forced to fire again because the electricity is around the right way. You can depolarize that because you can make it positive again. Absolute refractory is when it's still like this and the potassium hasn't done its job. At that point you can't depolarize anything because there's no polarization there. So once the potassium leaves and you have reset up your electrical gradient, you are halfway to resetting the neuron. You still have a problem though. You still have to reset the chemical gradient, because what you now have is a lot of sodium in here and a lot of potassium out there. You should immediately now look at that and go, oh hang on, but sodium's high on the outside and low on the inside, and potassium's high on the inside and low on the outside. So if you've got lots of potassium on the outside and lots of sodium on the inside, you have them round the wrong way. So the last thing that you have to do in making a neuron ready to fire again is reset the chemical gradient, and you do that by the presence of the good old sodium-potassium pump, which we met some weeks ago now. And remember, for one use of ATP, her ATP, 3 sodium ions out, 2 potassium ions in. Now that's really quite elegant, because that gets the sodium back where it should be, high on the outside, low on the inside. That gets the potassium where it should be, back on the inside, high on the inside, low on the outside. But because it's pushing out 3 positive charges and only taking back 2 positive charges, it's helping to repolarize the electrical gradient as well, make it even more polarized by basically removing positive charge that the potassium hadn't quite managed to do. So repolarization takes place in 2 stages. You reset the electrical gradient by opening up potassium channels after the sodium channels have been opened, and then you reset the chemical gradient by the continuous workings of the sodium-potassium pump, switching the sodium and potassium background and also helping to top off the electrical gradient. Now that is how an unmyelinated neuron conducts an action potential, which we talked about in depolarization. And all an action potential is the appearance of the positive charge moving down the axon. And the last thing to really think about is, well, what happens when the axon is myelinated? Well, in that case, that's myelinated there, and you've got another section myelinated here. Nothing can happen in this area because this is thick layers of fat. So there can't be any ion movements going between the fat because ions and fat are reject each other. So you get the same thing starting here, and you get the positive charge here, and the next set of sodium gates and potassium gates are down here. So what happens is that positive builds up, it jumps. The easiest way to think about that is think of a spark. When you put the plug in or out, if you get the plug just so close to the source of electricity, you can see it arc. You know, the spark is jumping. I use a lot of electrical fencing on the farm here, and as you bring, you know, the actual fence online and you're closing the actual electrical gate, you actually can see a really good spark going from one side to the other when they're still about a centimetre apart. So it's the same idea. The distance between here and here is really, really infinitesimally small. So the ability for the positive charge to jump across and cause the opening of these gates here is really quite straightforward. So these areas in between the myelination are called nodes of Ranvier. And this is where the depolarization occurs. It is also where the repolarization occurs. And so when it becomes positive here, it jumps onto there, becomes positive there, and then opens up calcium channels at the bottom. So it's much faster because instead of having to do it all the way down, it's just gone 1, 2, 3, and it's done. So long axons and some long dendrites are myelinated and the signal is jumped along it. That type of conduction is called saltatory conduction, the jumping from one node of Ranvier to the next. And so if I asked you, please explain the difference between an neural conduction or depolarization in an unmyelinated and a myelinated neuron, you would point out the myelination, you'd refer to the nodes of Ranvier, and then you'd explain that what happens all the way along an unmyelinated neuron, which is the depolarization is opening up of voltage-gated sodium channels, can only occur in the nodes of Ranvier, and then the charge jumps from one to the next, and it's called a saltatory conduction. And whilst there's many other things we can talk about in neurophysiology, that, in terms of the, focusing on the main concepts, is what we want to know about neural conduction. So thank you very much for listening.